There was a Florida Highway Patrol trooper who was just doing his normal patrol eastbound Interstate 4 near the DeLand area, and he sees a vehicle pulled off onto the shoulder of the road. The engine is running and the car's flashers are flashing, so it looks like it might just be a disabled vehicle. He quickly notices, though, when he pulled up behind the car, that there appeared to be someone, a person, slumped up against the outside of the vehicle. He used his spotlight to try to check it out a little bit and realized that there might even be a second individual in the grass nearby.
Hello?
By then, they've called for paramedics and they've called for the Volusia County Sheriff's Office. They also happened to shine their flashlights into the vehicle. And they noticed there are 3 small children in the back seat.
Opioid deaths are soaring in Central Florida.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a family in America that is not somehow touched by this.
If it hasn't touched your family yet, sooner or later it likely will.
Years ago, opioid usage in Florida was predominantly prescription painkillers. But as pill mills were shut down, heroin went on the uptick. And now an even more potent opioid called fentanyl is causing deaths at an alarming rate.
This poison doesn't discriminate. It's all races, it's all genders, it's all ages.
On this edition of Orlando Sentinel Snapshot, we're unmasking this epidemic and asking how Central Florida leaders are trying to stop it.
This addiction is overpowering, overwhelming, and it's destroying lives and destroying communities.
So, like your mommy, daddy.
That's who it is.
Mommy, daddy, and mommy.
The couple found on the side of the road was Daniel and Heather Kelsey.
It's the kids that are left behind. It's the parents that are left behind, the grandparents that are left behind. They're the ones that suffer because of their bad choice and stupidity. I knew something was really wrong. And I suspected even then, that it was drugs. I just didn't know what it was. They loved each other, but their personal life, it was like a roller coaster ride. Kind of one disaster right after the other. Somebody did this to me, and I'm quitting here, or we're moving from here because somebody did this. After a while, you obviously know it's the person that's running from the disaster that's the disaster.
Orlando Sentinel reporter Beth Cassim covered this story from the beginning.
Police tell us that through their investigation, interviewing family and friends, Heather and Daniel, at some point along the line, had developed an addiction to painkillers, and it appears eventually heroin.
Volusia County Sheriff Michael Chitwood is investigating the case.
These people were not criminals. They weren't street urchins who were out there doing robberies and burglaries. They weren't. They were people that had a disease, and the disease killed them. And in a disease, they lose complete focus on what reality is. That we have 3 kids that we need to raise, and we need to be there for. That wasn't what their priority was. Their priority was chasing the next high.
According to deputies, their first high was from prescription painkillers.
Daniel started, I believe, with a back injury and started taking medication for that. And Heather was taking painkillers from childbirth. And then it just proliferated.
Law enforcement says pain clinics could be to blame.
Almost everyone I talk to mentions pill mills in relation to the current opioid epidemic.
That's because many law enforcement agencies draw a line between the crackdown on pain clinics several years ago to more addicts looking for heroin today.
There were more painkillers being dispensed in the state of Florida than all the other 50 states combined, several times over.
If you were addicted to painkillers, you could go to one of these clinics and get yourself a prescription very easily. It might come from a real doctor, but this wasn't necessarily all on the up and up.
When they put the pill mills out, the ability to buy the pills dried up. And now, what do you turn to? You got to turn to something.
In Lake County, Sheriff Peyton Grinnell is also seeing this trend.
Now people are able to buy heroin cheaper, possibly get some of the same effects from it. All I know is that it's a problem here.
And the way he decided to tackle this problem went viral.
Last month or so, I've had several phone calls from citizens in this county concerned about the number of overdoses related to heroin.
This video, aimed at dealers who sell heroin and fentanyl, was viewed more than 1 million times.
To the dealers that are pushing this poison, I have a message for you. We're coming for you.
The reason for the urgency is from the introduction of a synthetic opioid called fentanyl.
Fentanyl is a painkiller. It's got really legitimate uses. Every hospital and clinic uses fentanyl to relieve pain. In the last 5 years particularly, illicit fentanyl on the street has become a huge problem.
This new stuff, this lace stuff is freaking horrible. You might as well step out in front of a bus. It's suicide.
In Orange County, Sheriff Jerry Demings is also dealing with an increase in fentanyl overdoses.
We are responding several times each day to an overdose situation. In many cases, what they believe to be heroin really is turning out to be fentanyl. You can't look at it and tell the difference.
The problem is fentanyl can be deadly in extremely small amounts.
People are used to injecting a certain amount of heroin. If they inject that exact same amount of the wrong drug or another drug, it could lead to death very quickly.
Fentanyl can be lethal in as little as 3 or 4 nanograms per milliliter of blood. Heather had 23 nanograms of fentanyl on her toxicology report. Daniel had 40. These would be considered extremely high and certainly very deadly rates.
And law enforcement across the state is working to lower these rates using a product called Narcan.
Usually they use a spray that goes through the nose, a nasal spray. It can also be injected. It will very quickly reverse the effects of an opioid overdose.
Paramedics, as well as an increasing number of deputies and officers, are now carrying the life-saving drug. It's also available to citizens over the counter at the pharmacy.
We only have on average about 4 minutes to get a person out of respiratory failure before they die.
It's unknown if first responders used Narcan on Daniel and Heather. It's also unknown who sold them the deadly drugs. But if investigators do figure it out, the penalty will be severe.
Let's not mince words here. These dealers are scumbags. What we have decided to do in 2017 is every overdose is going to be treated like a homicide.
Daniel and Heather's family, however, says the dealers are not the only ones to blame.
It's what happens when you make bad choices. If you're willing to do that, in my opinion, even though it was my daughter and son-in-law, you don't love those kids enough to get your life under control.
But in the months before their deaths, Daniel and Heather did seem to be getting their lives straightened out.
Just like an alcoholic, heroin addict, anybody else, they'd been good for a while, and they said, oh boy, we've been good, we're going to treat ourselves. We're going to have one last hoorah. And they did, and they didn't live.
They celebrated Christmas with their family less than a week before their deaths.
She roasted a pork loin, she made the meal all by herself. Her tree was trimmed in multicolored lights, and her and Daniel sat on the floor with the kids and opened presents.
Looking back, you'd have to say it was like a perfect day. I mean, if you had to leave with a memory, that one there was perfect.
It was nice. It's very nice. Didn't know it was going to be the last one.
Now, as these grandparents transition into being full-time parents again, the reality of their situation is setting in.
Say cheese!
Cheese and macaroni!
Used to go out and work out in the yard all day on Saturday and come inside and take a shower, and 8 o'clock at night go out to eat and have a cold beer. No more. Oh, come on. There you go.
Teenager years, I think, are going to be something else.
When the oldest one is 18, I'll be 75. It's not life on hold, it's a life sentence. It's going to be to the end.
Go, 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 go.
Go, go, go.
At the end of the day, the real victims in this are the 3 little kids. They lost their mom and dad.
Joey,
Say cheese!
who at the time was age 4, Aiden, who is 2, and Nicholas, who had just turned 1. They are a handful, but their grandparents are really proud of them and have told me that they bring a lot of joy to their lives.
Hey, Papa!
I think this story shows just how serious this problem is in Florida. I think that says a lot about where we're at in terms of this epidemic and how much it's growing. I hope this story certainly catches the eye of public officials to put more funding to treatment and certainly to provide resources to families when they're trying to figure out what to do with a loved one who seems to have an addiction.